everybody. I thought we'd start on time. I'd like to start on time, and we'll try to get out on time. We have a full schedule today with a lot of questions, I'm sure. And we will have a question and answer session at the end of our panel discussion, and we'll pass around a mic so y'all can ask questions. Good morning. I'm Bob Gray. I'm a partner at Mayor Brown, and I'd like to thank you for your interest in this important and as yet unsettled topic. Let me set the stage, though, because not everybody may be up to speed on exactly where we are. All of y'all know or should know that the BOEM issued its NTL 2016 number 1 to revamp the manner in which companies operating in the Outer Continental Shelf and the Gulf provide financial assurance to satisfy their decommissioning obligations. Specifically, as proposed under the NTL, among other provisions, it provided the exclusion process for qualifying companies to waive their financial assurance obligations would be eliminated and replaced with a downsized self-insurance mechanism. Co-lessees and co-owners would now be required to work cooperatively to provide financial assurance coverage for their leases and rights of ways and rights of use easement grants. And BOEM would be allowed to impose 100% liability upon each co-lessee and co-owner to decommission the entirety of each lease. Not surprisingly, BOEM received a significant amount of discussion to the new NTL from operators, trade associations, and some legislators. So where are we today? Recently, BOEM withdrew its NTL order pending a 6-month review to allow it to dialogue with industry and to gather input and feedback with respect to implementation of the NTL. Most recently, President Trump, 2 weeks ago, issued executive order on April 28th entitled Implementing an America First Offshore Energy Strategy that calls for the review and potential modification, and in some cases revocation and rescission of policies affecting OCS development, including NTL 2016 number 1. I believe we've assembled a great panel here today to discuss this very important issue to the offshore Gulf of Mexico E&P industry. As I said, I'm Bob Gray. I'm a corporate partner in the Houston office of Mayor Brown and represent parties acquiring interest in the Outer Continental Shelf, and therefore get to deal with the transactional implications of decommissioning liability allocation. Together with me today to moderate our panel is Tony Marino. Tony is involved in a wide range of energy-related transactions. He concentrates his practice generally in mineral title examination, the acquisition and divestiture of mineral properties, regulatory matters relating to onshore leases, and offshore leases, including state waters and federal waters on the OCS, and energy-related financing transactions involving the negotiation and performance of exploration, development, operating, and joint venture agreements. Tony will now introduce the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Bob, and I want to appreciate Bob and Mayor Brown for putting all this together. We talked about this panel about within 3 or 4 weeks ago, so it was pretty quick that we put this together. And we got George Tropiano from BOEM and Mike Vallejo from Marina, Eric Fago at Wortham, and also Bill Moss at Talos. George, we promised George we're going to have some questions from the panel itself, but also we'll have it from the floor, and I've already cautioned a few of you to be very nice to George. He's willing to come here. And you know, anyway, George has, actually, it's kind of strange, the NTL, some of you may know, was put on pause on January 6th of this year, and I tie that to 12th night, which is the beginning of Mardi Gras in New Orleans. So, but anyway, George is the program manager for the Risk Operation Management Group at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM as we know it. George is responsible for the National Risk Operations Program covering not only the Gulf of Mexico, but also the Pacific and Alaska OCS regions. And he has currently the decommissioning liability of over $35 billion dealing with that for those OCS regions. He was with, prior to joining the BOEM agency, George was with the chief of the Financial Management Office of the Financial Finance Center. And then we have Mike Vallejo from Arena. He's joined Arena in 2013. He manages Arena's credit facilities and is involved in the strategic planning, risk management, and corporate functions as well. He oversees planning, treasury, tax, and financial reports for Arena. I will tell you that both Mike and George were on a panel back in November that we were on, and so they've talked together on this issue, and we didn't do a PowerPoint for deliberate purposes, for them to give you just an update of what's happening since the pause earlier this year. We have Bill Moss as the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Talos Energy. Prior to Talos, Bill was a partner at Mayer Brown in Houston, where he was head of the Houston corporate practice. And then we have Eric Fiegel at Wortham. Eric is the managing director with Wortham Insurance and Risk Management. Eric has had more than 21 years of experience in the insurance and surety industry. And since joining Wortham Surety Group in 98, he has represented dozens of E&P companies. I've worked with Eric on another panel as well. And what we tried to do was to have someone from government, someone from the surety industry, as well as folks within the E&P operations, a financial person, and legal. So that's where we're going to go from there. The first question I'm going to pose, and really it's directed to George, but if anyone else on the panel wants to chime in, certainly can do that. We all know that the pause took place earlier this year, and it was a 6-month pause. And the question that the agency's been getting many times is, when will the NTL resume? Will the implementation timeline resume in June of this year?
Thank you, Tony. I'm going to stand up so that I could see the whole team over here. With regards to the NTL, obviously on on January 6th, the NTL was postponed and basically delayed for 6 months. And with regards to the 6-month pause, that was based on engagement with industry. We understand that there was a lot of complications and there was a lot of issues that we still had to deal with. And I wanted to highlight some of the items that were brought to our attention, why we thought that it would be prudent for us to basically put this pause in place. One of the items that we heard from industry is one size does not fit all. Okay, well, one of the issues was that we have obviously several types of segments. We have E&P, we have pipelines, we have upstream and midstream. And one of the issues was in terms of how the metrics were put together, we wanted to take another look at that. So we understood some of the challenges with regards to that. So with regards to the 6-month pause, we thought it'd be prudent to start engaging industry. We have engaged the OOC, OCS, and also pipeline coalitions. We are working diligently with them. They are bringing some proposals to the table in terms of how they want to look at risk from their perspective. We are also engaging the surety companies because we want to see from them in terms of how they basically develop their risk criteria in terms of bonding for the oil and gas industry. So the game plan is by the end of June, a draft proposal with regards to what industry has come up with and also what the government is also coming up with. We will sit down with them and look at that. Some of the key items that we are looking at is risk profiles. 2 types of risk profiles of companies and risk profiles of properties. So we're going to look at that from that perspective. So obviously the higher risk, the more financial assurance, the lower risk, the lower financial assurance. So this is more of a balanced approach. This way we can basically give credit where credit's due and obviously try to reduce and mitigate the risk with regards to where we see there's exposure with regards to lessees and properties. So the game plan is by the end of June, a draft proposal will be presented and basically vetted at that point in time.
Thank you. Let me ask Eric. Eric, what effect has the delay in the rule change implementation had on your company, surety company's interest and capacity to issue bonds?
I think it's actually been a good thing. It's been a good thing for the operators, obviously. So this can be more, well thought out. But obviously, what George has pointed out, the capacity is there.
Why don't you do
The surety industry is, they're in the business of risk, and I believe that there is capacity if you qualify. And what George just said is what was a very good point you made, George, is that the way y'all are looking at the properties and the companies, that's the exact approach that the sureties take, where there's the credit of the underlying operator and the useful life and what's left on the property. It's with perfect dovetail together.
Mike, there was a question regarding the protection of the taxpayer in particular, but as a taxpayer, what are your thoughts on the existing system and how well has it served the taxpayer from your view and your company's point of view?
Yeah, we got to write our own questions, so I've got some notes here. So this is a bit of a softball, but
you didn't share the answers.
So we went back and looked at some data, and we want to make sure the government looks at this holistically. And I think some of George's comments incorporate a lot of the feedback we've given before. But so it's 1985 to 2015. When you look at the government's P&L, they collected $80 billion in royalties, and they paid out maybe $10 million, and some of that was royalty relief. So when we look at that from a business model standpoint, that's a profitability margin, and I had to write the math down because it was pretty impressive. 99.9875% profit margin. That's better than our business for sure. And then if I look at it from a surety standpoint in terms of a loss ratio, that's 0.0125%. So when you look at the existing system, you have to say it's done a fantastic job. And I think it's been incredibly effective, and I give the government a lot of credit. So when we look at that, we say, why? Why has that system been so effective? There's been some high-profile, near misses. What's so good about it? And one, I give a lot of credit to the idle iron requirement. So every year, companies are going out and they're taking care of legacy properties. And that rule was put in place in 2010, and it's done a great job to help the government monitor kind of the players out there, make sure we're all keeping up with our stuff. So the problem's getting better, not worse, as we go forward. Two is really company risks. When we think about company ratings and the metrics the government put forth, it's really a second layer of protection. So companies can go out, they can raise debt, they can raise equity, and they can use those dollars to meet their financial obligations. And then if a company, unfortunately, if it needs to go through a restructuring or a bankruptcy, the government can still look at the asset value of the underlying property. So we think about kind of that in two contexts. One, in a restructuring context, we've had some pretty high-profile bankruptcies in the Gulf of Mexico here over the last 12 months. Those companies essentially left bankruptcy with clean balance sheets, almost no debt, and now are in a much stronger position to meet those future obligations. And for a liquidation type event, it's not a complete loss. So you're going to have properties that still have value. You're going to have buyers for those properties, and people are going to want to go out and buy those properties because there is value, and they'll assume those obligations. And for those obligations that there's no value left, there is some potential of loss there. And that's all for a sole lessee. Now, if this property has ever had anybody else in the chain of title, both as a co-lessee or predecessor in title, the government's got even more security. So you think about all the third-party financial assurance. Every time we go out and we purchase a property, the seller asks for a purchase price, but the second most important thing to them is that they go out and they get financial assurance. We've got to put bonds and escrow and LCs in place. And the government has that security to choose from. In terms of co-lessees, it's a great system for the government. It's joint and several, which means if I own 1% of any property and everybody else goes belly up, I'm on the hook for 100% of the liability. That's a great system. I could have designed a better one. And when you think about that 99.9875% profitability ratio, it's really because of that. And then lastly, most of these properties are owned by majors or larger companies at some point. So when you think about surety, you really got to think about their balance sheets. You've got all the security with the big guys. You've got Exxon, Chevron, Shell, large companies that have owned these properties and have been in the chain of title. And the government can go back to those guys. So I give a lot of credit for the system they designed, and I think it's been incredibly effective. And as a taxpayer, I'd like to see them take a little more risk. We should see more risk to get more development and more royalties and not be so concerned with the liability side here.
Yeah, and I just want to echo a couple things that Mike was saying there. I can't agree more that we need to look at it holistically, and one of the aspects of that is the activity level on the offshore and what impact the assurance for bonding we're requiring has on that. Every dollar of capital that we have to use to go provide surety, we can't use to go for development activities. And one great example of that is, with this downturn in the commodity price, we drilled a well last year that is producing 15,000 barrels a day for the last 6 months. If we had to post, what was proposed at one point, all the surety bonds and all the collateral associated with that, we couldn't have done that. So, that's a tangible example of, development that now the taxpayer is receiving all the royalties associated with that well. Who knows when we could have drilled that in a different environment. And I think that's important to keep, as we keep in mind as we look at this, that the activity levels and the royalties that are being generated from those are part of the equation as we determine what the right level for self-assurance is. And the second piece of that, I think you can't say it enough. These major bankruptcies, which I understand the concern about what the bonding liabilities are there, but in every one of those cases of companies that have emerged from Chapter 11, the decommissioning liabilities are in a much better situation now, because essentially the debt that was wiped off was third-party credit debt and not those liabilities. And I think that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind.
George?
Let me address the issue with regards to the bonding, because I know that the industry has an issue with regards to the double bonding. And specifically what Mike was saying, when you do these purchase and sale agreements, that obviously you have to take into consideration the bonds that you're going to have to put in place. Dual obligee bonds are an accepted form of financial assurance that BOEM is going to be accepting. I was talking to Eric. Eric was part of a transaction that actually successfully has done a dual obligee bond with BOEM. So please consider that going forward. We do also have boilerplate language with regards that you can use going forward. And please consider that in any transactions going forward, so that that will hopefully eliminate that dual bonding, double bonding issue with the dual obligee bonds.
Yeah, just to comment on what George is saying, is actually he just delivered to me for a client of ours that was interested in pursuing that, and there is a template that you can start from, and if you're in agreement with the provisions of that dual obligee bond, I think that takes your transaction further along than what you've seen in the past.
And I'll say, I think buyers are fine with that. It's the sellers that are going to be the real issue with the dual obligee language, and the concern there is they're putting that security in place because they've essentially got a guarantee back to the government being in the chain of title. Mm-hmm. And they're concerned that somebody's going to jump ahead of them, grab that security, and use it in a way they wouldn't use it. So again, the buyers and most of the independents in this room are buyers would be happy to sign up for that. Right. It's the larger guys who really push back. We've introduced the topic.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that has been a problem for some of the majors who are unwilling to be a part of that. But
well, I would encourage that the buyers put the pressure on the sellers, because the transactions I've seen in terms of the dual obligee bonds that are coming through my office includes all types of companies. Mm-hmm. So it's not limited to one segment. So I would encourage that you have those discussions with the sellers.
George, while we're talking about forms, can you tell us when the ROW and RUE forms will be ready?
Oh, the RU and RO forms?
Right.
Great question. With regards to the sole liability, because I know that was one of the issues with regards to the ROs being treated as sole and the RUs being treated as sole. I was talking to Bessie, the Deputy Director, Kevin Carl, and they're actually going to be issuing an NTL. Okay? That should be happening. The projected date is the middle of the summer. And one of the holdup there was with regards to surrounding the designated operator, because they're going to need designated operators for rows now. So the tentative timeline is summer, but again, don't hold me to that, because that's out of our purview. That's Bessie's Ballywick. With regards to the RUs, we've been getting some language from industry with regards to language that we could incorporate into a form very similar to the Bessie 0149 form that they use for assignments on rows. We've got that language. We are incorporating that into our documents, and we're working with solicitors in DC to try to finalize that.
Yeah, following up what George said, I spoke last week or so to Kevin Carl at Bessie, and one of the concerns I had, not so much for the form of 149 for the ROWs, but it was really a designation of a pipeline operator form, and we've actually shared some samples that are done in other regions that's been developed. So I think that's a process that will happen. It's just a question of how long. And we invited actually Bessie folks to come, but they weren't able to come today. But I wanted to ask Eric, in your opinion, what are the best or worst case scenarios for a Gulf of Mexico operator as it relates to bonds and under any proposed rule changes that are going underway?
Well, the worst case scenario would be the way as the NTL as it was laid out originally. you know, with the, you know, the original form of the NTL, that if that was fully implemented, and now it sounds like it's, you know, it's obviously been delayed and going to be adjusted. I mean, that was looking pretty bad, you know. But what's very helpful is hearing this today is the established forms, the dual obligee bond form. Having a statutory bond form, the surety industry would prefer to deal with a statutory bond form as opposed to a negotiated private bond with a dual obligee as BOEM as a dual obligee on that. You know, as we pointed out, the seller is in this one case that we worked on was very difficult to deal with, and had we had a dual obligee bond form, it would have been, you know, much easier. But I can tell you that the you know, the surety industry will look on these set forms favorably. But the best case scenario is like what we've been discussing is you know, there's some reasoning that's been into these changes, and I think it'll be very beneficial. You know, I guess that's the best case is what we're looking at.
Bill, George mentioned decommissioning estimates as part of his process. As an operator, what should BOEM look at in decommissioning estimates?
Well, we're a very strong proponent of having a system where companies prepare their decommissioning estimates and then get them audited by a third party. I think, you know, companies do this all the time. Putting in place a third-party audit system gives the government some assurance they can rely on those numbers. You know, when you look at the old system, you had 3 components for really determining what you know, what a company had to put forward in surety. You had financial statements. Government wasn't doing those. They were getting audited on those. You had reserves. Government wasn't doing the reserves. They were relying on a third-party audit. Why should the decommissioning estimates be any different? And I think, you know, we've seen just these numbers move all over the map with BSEE with regularity, and I don't think that's helpful to anybody. So I think, you know, companies have been doing this a long time. If the government could get the assurance that, you know, and you could do it much like you did with the PCAOB, where you have, you know, government-approved auditors who can audit the decommissioning liabilities, and I think you get a much more sort of reliable, dependable system that we're a strong proponent of that.
I completely agree with that. And just to put one more thing, I think you want companies going through that exercise. I think you want them constantly evaluating those liabilities and looking at those numbers and making sure they understand it. Because if they don't, that's when you get surprises. That's when you realize that you've got an issue that you didn't realize you had before. So if you put the onus on companies to provide that data, ask them to certify it like we do with financials or reserves, I think you're going to get better results long term.
Let me address that.
Yeah, in fact, that was a question I was going to raise with
obviously,
you.
BOEM has to defer to the sister agency, BSEE, as the subject matter experts, because they have the engineers, the expertise in terms of developing that information. So right now, we have to defer to them. But my understanding is that BSEE is encouraging industry to provide cost data to them so that they could basically change their models potentially, or basically get information that could potentially support or justify industry's information. So understanding that just started, I think, last year, but I think once they get a good data set, obviously that's going to be probably, you know, a food for thought for them to adjust their numbers either up or down. So it's going to be up to BSEE to do that. But unfortunately, right now, we have to defer to the BSEE information.
Yeah, George, I know that on, I guess, August 29th of last year, they did this global assessment where in some cases, as far as the shelf properties, the numbers went significantly higher than they were, and for the deep water, they actually were lowered.
Right.
And now I think even with the pipelines, although the numbers I think are still higher than what companies are considering as far as the assessments, they're lower than what they were assessed maybe a year or so ago. And just curious as to, you know, are y'all still going to follow that model of BSEE's assessment, or are you going to do something independently, I suppose, is what we were looking for?
Yeah, right, as I indicated earlier, right now, BSEE is the subject matter experts. We have to defer to them. But what I would do is encourage the companies to go and talk to BSEE and see if you can sway them to readjust their numbers.
Not to pick on you, George, but
Go ahead.
What companies, will companies receive any correspondence from you concerning the results of submitted disputes before the new orders are sent out?
Yes, absolutely. The game plan is we are diligently working on each company's disputes that were submitted. We have staffed up, so we are working on that. The game plan is to send out a letter with regards to our resolution of the disputes, and then we will also ask the companies if you want a meeting to discuss those results.
Great, good.
Yeah. There are some situations where there's been, where the companies can settle some financial assurance obligations on an informal basis outside of a formal order letter. Has that been developed at all, George?
Yeah, absolutely. I have 5 analysts that basically I've set up a system where each analyst has a portfolio of their own companies, and if you do have any issues with regards to you want to resolve any outstanding liabilities, you contact them or send an email to our basically our risk management operations mailbox, and it gets directed to the right POC. And absolutely, on a case-by-case basis, I prefer the companies coming in, talking to us, so we can resolve that before we have to issue any order letter. So please come in and talk to us.
Yeah, part of the problem is that once the order letter is issued, you have 60 days in which to either resolve it with the agency or file an appeal with the IBLA, and then that gets caught up in a process that it gets out of their hands to resolve
Right.
it. And George, you mentioned with the 5 financial analysts, are there folks that are, for instance, for a company that we may be representing, do we know which analyst is assigned to it? Is there some sort of spreadsheet that tells those companies?
I have the internal spreadsheet because I signed them all, but let me talk to management whether or not I can release that. I don't have a problem with that, but right now what happens if you do have any communication, you send it to the risk management mailbox,
And then
it gets forwarded to that
Okay. person,
and then that person will reach out to you.
That's fine, as long as we
Yeah.
know that if we send a request to risk manager to the link, then it's going to be assigned to one of the financial analysts, and then we'll deal with that person directly then.
Yeah, the goal is we review that mailbox each day, and we will respond within 24 to 48 hours.
Mike, in determining this financial risk, what financial criteria should the government look at from your point of view?
That's a good question. I think George highlighted some of the issues with this parallel criteria the government tried to identify earlier. So when you think about developing a financial criteria, you've got to start with a sample. So when you look at the sample, it's tough to really find a comparable group to begin with. So you've got majors in there, which are largely integrated. They've got upstream, midstream, and downstream ops, so that's not a great sample. You've got large independents, which a lot of times have multiple basins. For the smaller guys, even onshore versus offshore, you're going to have significant differences in financial structure. Financing for large guys versus small guys is really different. Large independents really are focused more on credit markets and equity markets. Smaller independents rely more heavily on the bank market with RBL facilities. So all these things kind of play into it. And then even then, GAAP throws some loopholes there where you've got successful efforts accounting versus full cost. And then depending on when someone did an acquisition or when they got impaired, numbers could be all over the place. So it's a hard starting point to begin with. And then on top of that, oil and gas is just notoriously cyclical. So when you look at 2010 through 2014, that's really the peak of a cycle. That's the wrong comparison period. We're all going to fail from here on out if that's our comparison period. And then 2015 and 2016 is probably too low of a comparison period. We're all going to pass, hopefully. So when we look at that, we say, why don't we just look at kind of an established framework out there? And we've got debt markets that rely heavily on the credit rating agencies. So you've got Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, and they publish their criteria. So, they publish their criteria along I think the appropriate vertical. So you can look at upstream E&P companies, and then they do a good job of rating companies. So when we look at that, we say look at size. The credit agencies look at size for about 40% of their criteria. And the way they look at size is daily production. That's the amount of hydrocarbons you're producing out of the ground on a daily basis. And your total proved reserves, which are things that are easily available off the financial statement. They look at operating and capital efficiency. So they look at the cash margin. So it's essentially the revenue you're getting per barrel equivalent less your cost to lift it out of the ground. And then they look at a full cycle ratio. So how much are you generating in profit divided by your cost to find barrels. So it's a pretty simple metric. If you're generating $20 a barrel and you're finding it for 10, you're making 2 times your money, you've got a profitable business model. If you're generating 20 and it takes you 40 to find, well, you'll be out of business pretty soon. So it's a pretty easy way of looking at the business. And then lastly, they look at leverage and cash flow coverage. So debt to production, debt to reserves, and then cash margin to interest expense to look at coverage. And when we see this, we see an established framework where you've got billions of dollars traded on both the high yield and institutional market. They rely heavily on these agencies to rate debt. And we just think it's a fantastic proxy to use, and it makes a lot more sense than trying to come up with a shadow type philosophy or a shadow parallel system.
Yeah. George, Bob mentioned at the beginning about the Trump executive order on April 28th. Has there been any consideration of implementing or reviewing that process? I know that we've talked about the pause up for the 6 months, but now with this new executive order, has there been a different focus?
Well, with regards to the executive order, that dovetails into the 6-month pause, because the 6-month pause was discussed with the previous administration, and that was put in place in anticipation of the new administration. So, the executive order just basically have indicated keep going with regards to the 6-month pause, and hopefully by the end of June we will have a briefing with regards to the potential proposal from industry and also to the government, to the management up in D.C.
George, this is a wildly speculative question, but there may be companies that are in financial trouble out there, and what advice would you give them, and how is BOEM approaching these companies as they're going through financial troubles?
Yeah, that's a very good question. What we're looking at right now is, if you notice, it was a paragraph in the notice to stakeholders indicating that at the discretion of the regional director, if there is a substantial risk of non-performance with regards to decommissioning liabilities, the regional director can issue order letters. So we are looking at all of the companies potentially in those types of circumstances, and at the discretion of the regional director, and we look at, based on the 5 criteria, 556-901, we assess those criteria and bump them up against what we see with regards to the specific companies, and at that point in time, the risk management operations group puts a recommendation to the regional director to move forward.
Bill, let me ask you this question. There's been some suggestion that, at least from some circles, that BOEM and best be reconstituted under one agency similar to the pre-2010 MMS. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll leave that up to the administration.
Bill?
Well, that would be a great development. I mean, I'd throw ONRR in there too. I mean, I think that this follows along with what Mike and I were talking about earlier in terms of a holistic approach. And I think, what we've seen again and again is sort of different, a segregation between different activities that aren't always coordinated. And I think if we put them together, I think we think that would be a very good development. One example is they brought up the NTL, and then in very short order after that, Bessie came out with new estimates, and I think it didn't seem like that was exactly what BOEM had in mind. And then I think, on top of that, you've got, as I was talking about before, taking into account the sort of the P&L of when you're looking at the risk, and then the potential on the other side of the ledger, what kind of activity levels are you seeing? What kind of royalties are people generating for the benefit of taxpayers? And I think putting them together would make the agencies look at it at a more holistic basis. I mean, I've had conversations in the past with BOEM and made exactly that point, saying, look, this isn't it a consideration what activity levels are, and that if you make the assurance for decommissioning liabilities too much where it's not necessary, you're reducing activities, and that's reducing revenue to the federal government. Shouldn't that be a consideration? And I've been told, well, that's not part of our mandate. And that just can't be the right answer. It should be looked at on a holistic basis, because I think Secretary Zinke said this several times in the last couple of months. It's what's for the benefit of taxpayers, and the ultimate recoveries to taxpayers based on both the potential exposure for decommissioning liabilities, but also what royalties are and what's being generated for the benefit of taxpayers, I think is how we should be looking at it. So if combining these agencies together facilitates that, I think it would be a very good thing.
Speaking of opportunity cost, while you're on a roll,
How much time have you devoted to collection and preparation of data to submit responses to BOEM? The various requests prior to the pause.
Yeah, I mean, in terms, I know you in your company and Mike's company as well, up until the pause, there were several requests for information, and I think it took a considerable amount of time and effort on the part of land, legal, and financial folks.
Yeah, it's been a real, I mean, it's definitely absorbed resources doing that. And I think, that brings me back a little bit, though, to the decommissioning liabilities that we were talking about before, and, talking to Bessie about those. And I know George is not speaking for them, but I think, anybody here who's been dealing with that process, when you go to them with your own data or the data they collected, at this point on where they are on the estimates, there's just, you accomplish nothing. There has been no down reductions in the estimates. And so, maybe that's a process that will work in the future, but it certainly isn't working so far in terms of taking into account certainly what our own data is on what it costs us to P&A things. And so, it's yet another reason why I think think that a third-party audit approach really solves a lot of problems there. And plus, it can, it reduces the burden on the agency to have to do that, and yet you're also getting a very reliable estimate there, just like you do for financials and reserves, which arguably are even more important in assessing what the risks are.
Yeah.
But I will say an opportunity cost. Every time there's an announcement that comes out of BOEM, from the financial side, I get calls from 5 or 6 different financial institutions. And every time we inject more uncertainty in a financial sense, that's going to result in a higher cost of capital. And really that results of 2 ways. One, people decide that the Gulf of Mexico is no longer a basin they want to play in. It's just too risky and there's not enough upside for them, which means you're going to the next guy who's willing to take that risk. And the reason the next guys want to take the risk is they have a higher cost of capital. So when you think about a holistic approach, again, we're partners with the government. We're aligned with you guys. We want to drill wells. We want to pay royalties. And the way to do that is to make it an economic trade-off where we can drill the next well at a cost and a financial cost where we're generating positive returns so we can pay those royalties. And then if we pay those royalties, we're actually generating more cash flow we can use to meet future P&A obligations. So I think getting as much certainty as possible in this process will be a big win for all of us because that'll make the financing much more easy.
Good point. Thank you very much. At this point, we'd like to leave some time for questions because I figured y'all probably have more questions than we've been able to ask. So we have a microphone that we can give to y'all so that everybody can hear the questions. And so I'd like to open it up now for questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Good morning. Thanks, everyone, for being here. This question is for Mr. Tropiano. George, thanks for being here. It's 2 parts of the same question. One is, once the new NTL is issued, is the timeline the same, or what is the implementation timeline? And the second part of that is, how do you take the uniqueness of each lease into account as you're implementing that timeline? So previously, there were kind of tranches based on perceived riskiness, so liabilities at the front end. Could you explain a little bit about the timeline and the different stages to it?
Yeah, with regards to the timeline, it'll be based on the new proposal. So I cannot commit to, whether or not it's going to be mimicking the previous one. So again, that's going to be based on the new proposal that will be coming out based on what industry and the government is working on. With regards to the second one, the uniqueness of the leases. There's been several types of options put on the table with regards to how to address that. Industry has come to us with regards to the issue regarding tailored plans. Right now, there's 2 options being put on the table, doing tailored plans by company and doing tailored plan by leases. Okay, so we are looking at both. We are listening to industry, and hopefully the latter option will address one of your issues there.
Any other questions for any of the panelists? Yes, ma'am. Yvonne?
I may have missed, that was loud. I may have missed, when you talked about dispute letter responses, did you give a timeline when we might expect a response on our dispute letters?
We're looking at hopefully early spring or early summer.
Any other questions? Here's your chance.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is for Eric here with Wortham, and the question is, on a surety basis, how much are you guys reviewing the P&A liability risk? And are you doing that in-house, or are you relying on BOEM's estimates right now, or the operators? And how do you assess the risk you're going to have to insure?
We rely on the data that we've received from our operators. Their reports, audits, third-party TSB reports. We're a broker. We're placing with the surety market. But this information is coming from our operators. They're doing a transaction. They're buying something of a major. We look at the economic one-liners, all the data that's provided, and we present that. We in-house, we have analysis that we do a presentation to the surety market. Basically, well, no, the TSB audit and their report. But the surety company that I stated earlier, it's a very good approach to what George has laid out is surety is looking at property by property and by the individual credit, underlying credit of an operator. So you could have, a not so great credit. They're doing a transaction, buying some really good properties, a better shot. Maximizing the profit.
Anybody else?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for all this information. It's great. In the onshore, there are programs, for instance, to do an orphan well program where everybody takes a little cut out of their royalty, and that's put towards a fund to deal with P&A obligations that are unresolved. I guess, has there been any discussion of doing this in offshore, and does anyone think something like that would be helpful?
I can answer that. The OOC has proposed a industry-wide fund with regards to that sort of scenario. They have not gotten any traction, so right now we're leaving it up to industry to come up with proposals to try to address that specific issue.
And I actually had one quick follow-up as well. Cobalt International Energy on their call, and forgive me if you can't address this, but they talked about it. They discussed a provision that they said had been part of the omnibus spending bill passed last Saturday that referred to extending the time between Gulf of Mexico operations would be extended from 180 days to 360 days. Has there been any update on that, when it might take effect, and what could go ahead from that?
I don't have that information.
Anybody else?
I hadn't heard
No.
anything.
Yeah, on the fund, one thing about on the fund, I think there has been a lot of discussion about that, and I think that, the devil's in the details, so working that out would be, is a challenge, but I think there's a lot of appealing aspects to it, and I think, there's, different size operators are on different sides of it, but I think one thing that to keep in mind about it that should be appealing to larger operators is, as Mike mentioned, every transaction we look at, surety's either the first or second discussion. It's a huge issue on every deal because of the magnitude of it and the concern of operators who they're selling to. And so, to the extent we could put something together that's a fund, I think that would be would really facilitate the transaction market, because you could sellers could then have more comfort that there was something there backstopping those liabilities that was more industry-wide. Because like I said, we've had any number of transactions that I know a lot of other folks have too that they don't get done because the surety obligations are so high. And so I think that's one thing to keep in mind for larger operators as we think about that. And yeah, and the other thing is too, I think, is that George was talking about the Coop OD Bonds. I think when you have joint and several liability already for everybody in the chain of title, if it is a significant operator that's already in the chain of the title, I guess my question would be is, why do you need to be a co-obligee? You've already got joint and several liability with everybody in the chain of title. So it shouldn't really matter. If the perspective is what's the risk to the taxpayer, if there are major operators in the historical chain, there is no risk to the taxpayer. So whether they're bonds there or not, from our perspective, shouldn't really impact the analysis. But
Yeah, going to your question on the Orphan well as well, the average royalty rate for offshore is going to be kind of 16 to 18%, and if you look at onshore lands, it's about 12%. So I can be a little biased here, but you might argue that there's a 4 to 6% royalty that can be set aside by the government discretionary right off the bat to pay for these things, which should more than cover any obligations there.
Anybody else? Any other questions? If none, we'll get you out of here on before time. And yes, sir.
Oh, Gary. Now, remember, it's a question.
I have an 8-part question, but just one question. No. First of all, George, I appreciate you being in the line of fire again. So I do appreciate it. And I like that you are, the agencies are seeking comments from industry before you issue the order. And I appreciate that. The panel has raised all the significant questions, so I'm going to just say thank you for sending out the 2006 NTL, because with now no lease sales in New Orleans, this is the only way we get to network. So thank you.
And with that,
And it's hurting New Orleans' economy, the restaurants, the hotels. Yeah, y'all need to just come over and have a party anyway, I think.
I will tell you that we will send to each of y'all a link to this event so that you can send it on to others or review it yourself if you want to get some more detail and try to remember any notes you haven't taken. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Greatly appreciate Slattery, Moreno, and Roberts joining with Mayor Brown on this, and with George, Eric, Bill, and Mike coming. And thank you very much. Y'all have a great day.
Okay.